Everybody, welcome back to the channel. I know, it's been a long time. What can I say? Life has gotten in the way. I am working on the first of the Q&A videos, the history of the Stoic school. I hope to have that up soon. It's not taking me so long because it's going to be so awesome. As usual, it will continue to be the high level of production quality you've come to expect from this channel. That's a joke, son. But I hope it'll at least be useful. It's just taking me a long time to get to it because, the best laid plans of mice and men, sometimes things just get in the way. So anyway, without further ado, we're going to talk about something else. I got into a conversation on the Facebook Traditional Stoicism group, and somebody asked a very good question, and some of the responses were, I took issue with some of the responses. And I thought it would be fun for me just to kind of do an off-the-cuff rant on the subject to you guys. So the question was posed by somebody named Justin. Justin, if you're listening to this, I hope you don't mind that I name dropped you. Justin asks, or says, he's having a hard time finding the argument put forth by Socrates and expanded by the Stoics in the Euthydemus convincing. So Socrates argues that things such as health, wealth, and fame are indifferent because they can be used well or badly. Therefore, they're not good or bad necessarily in themselves. It's the knowledge of how to properly use them that constitutes the good. And the Stoics expand all this to include all externals as indifference as they pertain to eudaimonia, or happiness. Here is his issue. So far, no disagreements. Here is his issue. How could something like, for example, losing someone's child to cancer ever be considered not bad? Yes, this is an external, and it seems like no matter how virtuous you are, as a human being, you have to look at the situation and say, this is bad. I mean, someone could respond, oh, it's just an unpreferred indifferent, but that doesn't really address the fundamental claim put forward, which is, how can it be good or bad for the achievement of eudaimonia, or happiness? And I think, if I didn't say so in my response that I wrote, Justin, I think this is an excellent question. It cuts to the very meat of the issue with Stoicism. I alluded to this in another video, or at least one other video, possibly in multiple videos, about this term from Christianity, theodike, or theodicy, God's justice. Well, how do you justify the suffering in the world in the face of an existence or a creation that you affirm to be fundamentally good? How can you do that? In some ways, this is easier in the Judeo-Christian traditions, and in some ways, it's harder. It's easier, or let me put that the other way around. In some ways, Stoicism has an easier justification, and in some ways, it has a more difficult justification. The justification is easier in the sense that the Stoic conception of God is not authorial. God doesn't stand above existence and arrange events however God chooses, but rather existence, the cosmos, is itself in some sense the body of God. And so therefore, just like I can't touch my left ear to my right hip, there might be certain limitations involved that make certain tragedies inevitable. This is also related to the idea of things being conjointly fated. So if you were born, you have to sicken and die. It's not the ability to arrange things ex nihilo entirely to suit the human experience is not a concept included in Stoicism. However, there is a sense in which Stoicism, and indeed all of the ancient philosophical schools that are similar, that posit eudaimonia as the end goal of human existence, have a harder time, because according to the Abrahamic traditions, and this is especially true in the religion of my upbringing, Judaism, there is no negative judgment about you grieving. So if something terrible happens and you personally are aggrieved by this, you're not required to buck up and bear it necessarily. There might be encouraging words like, "Oh, it's all part of God's plan," blah blah blah. But there is not an added failure of if you break down in the face of tragedy. Um, there's no pejorative judgment on that necessarily. Uh, Whereas in Stoicism, Platonism, pretty much all of the eudaimonic schools, since the goal is on your happiness, the injunction is that you need to be able to deal with tragedy in a more philosophical manner. And that is tough, especially when someone is facing real tragedy. As some of you know who watch this channel, I'm a dad. I have two beautiful little girls. And I have unfortunately been, or depending on how you look at it, fortunately, I'm very fortunate in that my children are healthy, and I thank Hestia, the gods, every day that my children are healthy and happy and have a good life. But I have stood close to the blast radius of real tragedy. I know several members of my family who will never see their children grow up. And my wife as well has had friends who have had horrible circumstances thrust upon them. And I'm in my early 40s, so I've lived enough life to know that it's very easy to quote high-minded phrases when you're not the one that's been struck down by tragedy. Mike Tyson had a saying that everybody in a fight has a plan until they get punched in the face, and life will punch you in the face. So I take very dim view of the kind of glib answers of, oh, well, it's an indifferent and you just have to see it as an indifferent. No, F you. Like, that is one of the most horrible things that one has to deal with in life. And to sort of just brush it aside and say, well, that's just the doctrine, or you're just using different definitions of the word bad. Like, I don't mean to be harsh on those people. The people who kind of offer those sort of by the book explanations, I think in a lot of cases they're young, they haven't experienced tragedy yet in their life or been around somebody who has, and they're often not really able to grapple with the real emotional impact of the event. So that's a way for them to kind of push it aside and say, oh, well, here's the answer. It's like, well, let's dig a little deeper. So I'd like to share with you the answer that I gave. I'm not necessarily happy with this answer in the sense that, it's so good, but I feel like I at least tried to give the event the emotional significance that it deserves, even if it's just a hypothetical. I hope the original poster isn't speaking from personal experience, and this isn't something that they themselves actually, a burden they're actually dealing with. But whether it's hypothetical or real, I tried to give this weight. So my response here is, first of all, I think whether we're talking about this particular situation or any real tragedy, we have to recognize that arguments can have logical force, but still be hard for us to deal with. So Stoicism attempts to thread the needle, if you will, between the cynic position that only virtue is a good and externals are completely indifferent, and Aristotelianism, which posits that virtue may be necessary for happiness, but it's not sufficient. In order to be truly happy, you also have to have wealth and health, etc., etc. The Stoic position is that externals have value, and we are correct in preferring a certain disposition to them, but ultimately our happiness is dependent on virtue. Now, when we say happiness, we need to be careful, because the Stoic word, once again, is eudaimonia, a good spirit, which we could translate as contentedness or blessedness or benevolence. The English term happiness is close, but eudaimonia is deeper and more significant. And I think that's part of our problem. If we say that you should be happy watching a child sicken and die, or watching a friend suffer, or watching a parent descend into dementia, I think that's ridiculous. And anybody who says, well, you should be happy, that bullshit. However, if you take the Aristotelian position that these things are also necessary for true happiness, it would follow that somebody who has had this level of tragedy visit them in their lives could never be truly happy. And we know from either from tragedies in our own life or from seeing other people grapple with tragedy that this is not necessarily the case. Some people encounter true tragedy, horrific tragedy, and they mourn their loss, and then they pick themselves up and they find reasons to live. And eventually they right themselves and they find joy in the world and life. And given enough time, they can even look back on their tragedy with a smile, not in the sense that they're glad it happened, but in the sense that they accept it as part of the greater joy of life. And then there are others who fall down a spiral of despair and never pull themselves out again. And Stoicism challenges us to ask the question, what separates the people who have resilience and those that do not? And it is only this. It is the disposition of their character. So a virtuous person can eventually right themselves. The non-virtuous person will blame God, life, society, themselves, fate, and they can become bitter and miserable until the day comes that they too depart this life. Now, we should also say something about virtue. The term virtue in English has certain connotations that are gained from Christianity, and these aren't necessarily bad, but they can lead us astray when we try to understand the Stoic position. So, virtue in Stoicism is active, erete, excellence, and it involves engagement with the world. This is what separates Stoicism from cynicism. Stoicism sees the human social relationships as a part of nature. So it is virtuous for us. It is excellent. We're called to be excellent towards the other people in our families, in our communities, our friends. We are to engage with them in a human and caring way. And so the virtuous behavior in the place in the face of suffering is not to be inhuman. It's not to deny the human feelings that are to some extent beyond our control. One person commented, and I don't mean to call them out, but I want to address this point. They said, we fear death. Our fear of death is social conditioning, or our view of this tragedy is a social conditioning, and I take serious issue with that. Even a dumb insect will flee death. Apes will mourn and hold funerals of sorts for loved ones that pass. A dog will throw itself on a larger animal that is attacking a member of its pack, especially a young member of its pack. These reactions are inherent in our nature. It is natural for a parent to care for a child, or for a brother to care for a sister, or a friend to care for a friend. So I don't think that brushing the weight of that aside serves us in our quest to live a more virtuous life. Jordan Peterson writes that one should strive to live in such a way that one can be the most useful person at one's father's funeral. And that doesn't mean that you're unfeeling, but it means that you master your emotions, that you remember the goodness in someone's life, and that you accept the tragedy as part of a greater whole. And that attitude, to my mind, is Stoic, and it's what makes Stoicism a heroic and a humane philosophy. This might be politically incorrect, but I think this is especially true for men. If you are a man, you need to be the rock that supports your circle. And women too are called to do this. But I think women have a different relationship with their children than men do, by virtue of the fact that they are literally from their body. Um, Maybe that's sort of beside the point, but that's how I think. Uh, anyway, I hope that was helpful. I hope it made sense. And I'd also like to add that Stoicism doesn't call. You can also think about this in the terms of righting oneself, right? So, someone who is virtuous will right themselves faster than somebody who isn't. And the sage will right themselves so quickly that they'll never stumble. But we are not sages, and we are not expected to be sages. The only thing that we are enjoined to do is to love wisdom and to make progress. So I hope you're well, and I hope to have another video for you soon. May the gods keep you and your families and your friends healthy and well. Thank you.